Hello, everyone. So, we're going to talk today about the chapter on sexual behavior and experiencing sexual pleasure. So, this is kind of like, the chapter when people make jokes about a human sexuality class where they go, "Oh, all you guys talk about in there is like pleasurable ways to have sex and what feels good." And that's all the class is about is only the act of, sex between yourself or people, but you probably know by now that it's more complex than that. We're going to talk about physiology and biology, and then of course we're going to get into things like sexual behaviors and pleasure. But we're going to talk about culture, and we're going to talk about human sexuality as just kind of a part of the normal human experience. And so for this chapter, I do want to say, just like with every other chapter, if there are things that that we're going to cover that you're not comfortable with other people in the room being a part of, get some headphones or find some place to watch this alone, because there will be some images in this chapter that are maybe a bit more graphic than others. So just wanted to throw that out to you right away so that you're aware. So situate your surroundings as much as you can, if that's an issue. If it's not an issue, then fantastic, right? Okay, so I'm going to start off. Oh, let me say this. I'm going to split this chapter up into really two parts. So today, in this video, anyways, this video lecture, we're going to talk about a little bit of background about some history on thoughts on sexual pleasure, and then we'll talk about ways that it's measured, and then we'll also talk about solo pleasure or masturbation in this chapter, and then we'll get into other forms of pleasure in the second half. Okay. So, being that we're going to talk about masturbation this chapter, I got my handy book, The Sexy Origins and Intimate Things, the rights and the bits, the rights and rituals of straights, gays, bis, drags, trans, virgins, and others, by Charles Panatti. And this is a really cool book. So here we go. If you want to know some word origin, which is kind of what I'm picking out the book to read for us, but there is a lot more in this big thick book. It's really really interesting from beginning to end. But for today, let's talk about the word origin for dildo. Okay, so the word dildo is from the Latin dilatare, meaning to open wide, to dilate, to expand. Okay, right? It's the basis for the Italian verb dilatar, which is to give pleasure, which in turn gives us the term for a person who loves a field of knowledge in a superficial way, a dilettante. Right? Dildo is also related to the Italian noun diletto, meaning delight, which can also be used as the endearment beloved. Right? The word is chock full of pleasurable and loving meanings. Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, traces the spelling dildo to around 1598. But the practice of using dildos predates the word, and in fact, it predates what we think of as modern forms of written language. Well-preserved artifacts of dildos have been found in most primitive cultures. It means most, right? Almost all primitive cultures, they find something be used as a dildo or shaped as some kind of like phallic object, right? Images of dildos were painted on Greek pottery and Egyptian frescoes. They're chiseled into East Indian, stone friezes and carved into Chinese ivory artifacts. They provide humor in many classical plays in the East and the West. In a Greek play from the third century BCE, one woman complains to another that she's tired of her friends borrowing her beautiful new scarlet leather clad dildo before she's had a chance to pleasure herself with it. Right? So during the Hellenistic age, the Mediterranean seaport of Miletus is the home of Thales, the first recorded philosopher of Western civilization. And you can go back to Eastern civilizations, and it's much older than this, right? But of Western civilization was renowned. It was as the center of dildo manufacturing and export. And the ancients were like much less squeamish than we kind of modern people are when it came to having sex with a disembodied phallus, which is how some people look at it. No, they in fact they love their sex toys, and many public rites and rituals are based on the bold and unembarrassed use of dildos. Interesting, huh? So nothing new about dildos at all. Not surprising. I mean, we are sexual beings after all, just like, you know, other mammals. Okay, so let me share my screen with you and we'll get to this PowerPoint. Here we go. So like I said, I'm splitting this up into two parts, and today we'll look at some history about sexual pleasure. Hmm. Why is my oh, there we go. So history about sexual pleasure, then we'll get into some kind of like ways to measure it, survey research that's done on the topic, and then we'll talk about masturbation a bit. All right, but first off, since we're talking about history, it made me think. Um, trying to bring in some history and really some like cultural anthropology is really what it is. At to the beginning of these classes by reading from this book for you about like word origins related to human sexuality. But then I thought, well, okay, if we're going to talk about sexual behaviors, and I've read in books that in certain parts of the world, like we think of the ancient Greeks, like not being like as the book said, squeamish about things like dildos, for example, or even masturbation, compared to kind of our culture now. Like even if people are doing it, they're not talking about it very much, at least not seriously. So that means there's a spectrum there about sexual pleasure, right? So as we go on to talk about sexual behaviors and health, and then fantasy and masturbation and things like erotic touch, as we go on to the second part of the chapters, keep in mind that this idea of sexual behavior and pleasure is on this spectrum. Like on one end, you've got like very repressed types of cultures, and on the other end, you have the most expressive, or what you might call like sexually enlightened, I suppose. So I was trying to do like a dig on the internet for you guys to find out, okay, what is the most sexually repressed culture in the world? We'll start there, at least as has been documented. Then we'll go on the other side of the spectrum in a second, and we'll talk about like the most sexually kind of liberated culture. What you'll probably find in the extreme examples is that neither of those really will work for you. Like they don't necessarily, you know, they're not an example of probably your sexuality. That people experience sexuality differently. So I wanted to find, what's in academic circles, where can I find the most repressed and the most liberated? And so I had to dig through some culture anthropology journals to find these. And I don't know if this is, considered 100% valid by anthropology. It's not my area, but nonetheless, it's interesting, right? So there may be cultures even more repressed than this, but we could start here, right? So let's look at a very sexually repressed culture, perhaps the most sexually repressed, the Enos Beg. And I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. And this is from the 1960s. So they were considered at the time when it was written in the 60s the most sexually repressed culture in the world. That's not really what the culture is called. So this is really to protect this culture. They don't refer to themselves as the Enos Beg, but it's to protect the anonymity of the people who lived there. There's still people living there on this island, which is off the southwest coast of Ireland, right? So you see these little islands in red here. In the 60s, anyways, 350 people living there. It's a very rural community, rather fishing and farming, and sexuality is extremely taboo in this culture, right? So if you don't know, that word taboo means this type of behavior is prohibited and restricted by very rigid and strict kind of social customs and norms, right? So it's really looked down upon, the idea of sex and sexuality. So like their perspective on sex is that it's dangerous and it's unhealthy. So that presents a problem, because what about offspring having children, right? So how does this occur if they have this view of sex? So here's what I could find. So I'll read to you some excerpts from what I could find from these anthropological journals from the 60s, that sex occurs after parents arrange the marriages, and sex is seen as a marriage duty aimed at procreation, and it's only to occur in one position, right? That's a man on top of a woman. Like that's the position that is appropriate. So the spouses wear smocks to cover as much of the body as possible, and the goal is to finish the act of sex as quickly as possible. They do have some weird notes about like what we would call foreplay. They will accept very light kissing and grabbing of the buttocks. That's how it's written, and I guess that's it, right? So no oral sex, no digital stimulation, no masturbation. Any sexual exploration of your own body is considered taboo. Talking about sex or sexy talk, also taboo, looked down upon. If people are sexually expressive in public, then they were, severely punished. One thing I read in this culture too is that not only were people severely punished by being like basically whipped or flogged in the middle of the square, and people go watch right in the middle of this like the town square. Um, is that they extended this even to dogs. So if they had dogs who were doing things like licking their own genitals, same thing. They would take them out in the public square and beat them, according to these anthropologists. Right, it was wild. Right? So the other thing about them that was interesting is that they were reportedly terrified by the idea of menstruation, and also childbirth and spontaneous ejaculation. So if people are not masturbating, particularly the men in this culture, it's not uncommon then to have spontaneous ejaculation in the form of what we would call like nocturnal emissions or wet dreams. But even when you are having a bowel movement, right? When you're pooping, this is also if you haven't ejaculated in well, it varies, but having ejaculated in a longer period of time, then you can expect to see some ejaculate when you're using those same types of muscles, same muscle groups. So that would be very frightening to them. Something that they would probably feel shameful about and keep secret. After all, they might be flogged in the public square if they were to talk about it. So yeah, terrified of menstruation, childbirth, spontaneous ejaculation. And then get this, what we would call menopause, all the symptoms associated with menopause, they equated with disease. And so many women within the culture, some women there in this picture, they would climb into bed around like age 40 and they would just stay in that bed until death, right? So extremely sexually repressed and definitely not, an example of sexuality that, if it's speaking for myself, would work for me at all. Um, but that's the thing, right? There's diversity in in experiencing sexual pleasure and in knowledge about sexuality itself. Okay, so let's look at the other extreme end here, and these are like the most sexually kind of liberated culture that I could find in the anthropological record. And by the way, I'm not an anthropologist, all right? It's not my background, so there may be even more extreme on these ends, or some of this might be embellished. I don't know enough about the field, but it was really fun for me to look up literature outside of psychology. So I thought I would share with you. So on the other end, we have the Manjaya. It's part of the Cook Islands. It's very different. They're not like this today. I should point that out. From what I read, was also from like the 50s and 60s. And here, sex is thought about very differently. It's almost like it's a currency, right? They thought about it like money. Um, is to us, right? Or like religion. So it's strange. It has like it's a currency, it's spiritual, and it's also a competition, right? So that's what sex was like in this culture. It's not only like approved of, but it's thought of as very important and encouraged. So far, I mean, it doesn't sound that bad. I don't know. Maybe the competition part's weird, right? But here's where it gets probably outside of our comfort zones is that you're encouraged from a very early age to have sex as often and with as many partners and for as long as you can. So that means like a sexual like act. If you think about like might you call it an episode or a session, something like that, should last as long as it can. Um, and it should be you should produce pleasure for both people. So that's very different, right? But then they don't get tied up as much as somebody is having sex with as many people as possible if they're not kind of gone through a ceremony where they show their commitment to each other. It's not frowned upon, right? It's considered normal and good for you to do so. So that's their culture. It doesn't really work by our standards necessarily. But here's some examples that I read. So at age 4, here's a common practice: they would segregate by sex, and they'd have these really large open like open aired like sleeping rooms, like big lodges, basically, like really really big. And they would segregate people by sex, way all sleep in this big open room with males on one side, females on the other, that kind of thing. Okay, that's like they start that at age 4, that segregation at night. And then from about age 7 to 9, children are taught about how to masturbate, and they're encouraged to. But it does say that they were also told not to do it too much. Like, I don't have any qualifiers for like what too much is. That's just what it said in these reports. So they were encouraged to, but like with some restraint, I guess. Um, Now, when you get to puberty, let's talk about the boys first here. Um, as pubic hair grows, and boys have a retractable foreskin, they're not circumcised, but this is when they would go through a like what we would call like a super incision, right? So it's a circumcision kind of ritual that happens at puberty for boys. All right, so here's how it goes for this super incision. The father invites an expert in the tribe, or two, depending on how much kind of money or social kind of clout that the family had, and they would take the son to a secluded place, like a secluded beach or a mountain stream, but usually by water, right? And they would make a lateral incision. The picture of the island there, so you see how small it is, right? They would make this lateral incision along the penis and as far up to the stomach, right? And while the scar heals, the experts would teach this young man how to sexually pleasure a woman by teaching him how to perform cunnilingus, teach him about like breast suckling and stimulating the breasts, and how to induce orgasms in their sexual partners. And then the young man is paired with an older woman who is run through these practice sessions, someone he's been practicing with, right, including penetration. And at this point, what makes them experts, I guess, is, I mean, I couldn't believe this when I read it, that during penetration, at some point, this woman would remove the lateral incision scab with her own vagina. I thought, no way, that's wild, right? Okay, so that's a little different from our customs, right? But to them, this is what you do, right? This is considered normal behavior for this group of people in this time. Okay, now puberty for girls. So girls also practice masturbation. They would do this by pressing their, let's see, it said they would do this by pressing their thighs together and rocking back and forth on their heels. The girls were paired with an expert also to help them learn how to achieve orgasm. So everybody gets paid with these kind of like sexual mentors, um, boys and girls, as they go when they're going through puberty. Orgasm easily achieved for both men and women. So orgasm wasn't thought of as the goal for sex. The goal for them, like how if sex was like successful, or it met a certain standard, was that they had matched reactions, and that meant that whoever was involved in the sexual act, that they both had the same type of reaction to the sex they're having with each other. And if there was a goal, it was simultaneous orgasm, like for both people to orgasm at the same time. Okay, so that's interesting, right? And you were considered to have great sexual prowess if you could do these things, if you could you know bring your partner to orgasm, and especially if it took a long time, and then if you could actually have this orgasm at the same time as them, right? It's very different from the first culture we talked about. But also, sex was seen as a competition. So the idea was, you would have like social standing if you had more partners, if you had sex for the longest period of time before orgasm, or if you could deliver the most, satisfying, sexual partnership. Another common belief is that the more partners one has, the less likely they are to get pregnant. Um, yeah, it doesn't really work that way, of course, but this is what they believed to be the truth. They believe that pregnancy comes from spending. They thought was this is what they attribute pregnancy to, right? Not our scientific definition, right? But instead spending too much time with one partner, not just sexual time, right? But just time, spending too much time with one partner would lead to pregnancy. And then pregnancy is what leads to marriage and then to monogamish relationships. Like I wouldn't say completely monogamous, but monogamish, right? And a little more, I mean, it's where it gets the gray area, right? You dedicate yourself to one person and creating a family, but they are a little more forgiving if there was like what we would call sexual infidelity, right? So, all right, often, another thing I wrote down that I thought was interesting. Often, young men crept across this segregated sleeping area I was talking about earlier. They would kind of sneak across at night when everyone's sleeping, right, to kind of coax a young woman into sex. It doesn't go into great detail about what that means, but it did say if they were discovered by the other women, then they were evaluated, right? They weren't necessarily told to like stop, but they were going to be evaluated for how much pleasure the woman received. And they hoped for things like a pregnancy and for marriage. um, if the young man, they thought it was not a good match for the woman that he was trying to coax into sex, or he wasn't very good, according to them, he wasn't what helping create pleasure for his partner, or if he had an orgasm too early, kind of premature ejaculation, then he would be shamed and kind of sent back to the other side of the room to kind of go back to sleep. um, it was kind of interesting that it was very public, right? And then I don't know much about like how much consent was involved. It just doesn't really go into that in these old articles. Okay, also on the island, you could say this because there's such a small population. They had like very few, if not, almost no records of an instance of like intersex individuals. But it's not so far fetched. They're so tiny. It's such a small population. Um, Homosexual acts, like what we would think of as homosexual, they would think of as instructional. And sexual orientation was not socially constructed in the same way as ours, right? So it wasn't as rigid. And they didn't, but here's one's interesting. They didn't have sex toys, right? And um, that's interesting, and that's different from other cultures. And the greatest fear for them, for men and for women, when they actually were asked people on the island to report their fears, is something they called tiramate. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correct, but it means dead penis in their language, or impotence. Like that's the biggest fear, is being impotent. I think that's a big fear for everyone everywhere, but this was their biggest fear, right? So that's kind of interesting to point out, I think. So again, this is not my personal sexual philosophy, and it's probably not yours either, right? This one's probably too liberated, whereas the first culture we talked about, too repressed. And most of us are somewhere in the middle there trying to figure it all out. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. Another thing I wanted to go over, whoops, we're going too fast. I wanted to talk about um, is how we might measure things like sexual pleasure. And so we can talk about this idea here that comes from this survey, the Sexual Opinion Survey. Hold on just a second. I'm getting a ring at my door. Okay, so we're back. So we're talking about the Sexual Opinion Survey, and this is one way you can kind of judge an individual, or if you want to look at a culture and look at like larger data sets, you can say some people or some groups of people are more or less erotophobic or erotophilic on this spectrum here, really, and most people are somewhere in the middle, right? So you might think of it more like, okay, how right or left of center are you? Do you lean more towards the erotophobic, or do you lean more towards the erotophilic? Like personality, surveys, or models. These are spectrums. They're not hard dichotomies. So it's very rare you'd find someone who's like 100% erotophobic or 100% erotophilic. That's probably not good to be that. I mean, if I'm going to make a judgment about your attitudes, It's probably not good to be 100% one way or the other. Most of us kind of have mixed emotions or mixed thoughts or just complexities to us. So keep that in mind. It's the same thing with like personality psychology. Most of us are not like, for example, 100% extroverted, right? Or 100% introverted. It's hard to even imagine somebody like that. So think about it in that way. It's hard to imagine a person who's 100% erotophobic or a 100% erotophilic. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but there's usually some underlying like anxiety there, and maybe some history of abuse, things like that. Okay, so let's talk about the erotophobic and the erotophilic. And this is really this survey is to measure opinions or attitudes about sex, right? So here's just some examples of questions you might find on the survey, that the SOS, or sexual opinion survey. Like, I think it would be very entertaining to look at erotica, right? So imagine yourself, like, scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate that? You think it's entertaining to look at erotica. How about swimming in the nude with a member of the opposite sex? Would that be an exciting experience? I personally find that thinking about engaging in sexual intercourse is arousing to me. There you go, right? Almost all erotic material is nauseating. So that one you could see would be reverse scored in the opposite direction, right? So you're just rating on this scale how to what extent you agree with or disagree with these statements, right? And the last one, masturbation can be an exciting experience. So these are the types of questions, it's not the complete survey, but these are types of questions that are on that survey. And this is used to kind of gauge people's attitudes or their opinions about sexual behavior. And then there's some things that correlate, like demographics that correlate with these two dimensions, if you are more or less erotophobic or erotophilic. So erotophobic, of course, that means you have a more negative attitude, right, towards sexual behavior, and erotophilic means that you have a more positive attitude. So we can look at some of these issues and compare them side by side, right? So when you think about the issue of traditional sex role behaviors, like what's the script for men when they behave sexually? What's the script for women when they behave sexually? Of course, the erotophobic are going to be more adhering to those kind of like traditional types of roles, and the erotophilic, who have more positive attitudes about sex in general, tend to be a bit more flexible and a little more tolerant or accepting of people's different sexual roles or sex behaviors. For men in general, men tend to be a bit more erotophobic. So that may be surprising to you, but they have more like rigid ideas uh, about sex, or they have more rigid attitudes or opinions about sex. And then women tend to be a little bit more erotophilic with their attitudes about sex, being more positive. So women generally have more positive attitude than men, right? There we go. That's interesting, right? Because we tend to think, oh, men are all, you know, the horn dogs and all they think about is sex and that kind of thing. And maybe, right? Maybe they think about it more, but this is their attitude, not their frequency, that's measured with this scale. So they may think about it more, but they might have more of a kind of a rigid idea or criteria for their what constitutes a positive attitude towards sex. And women tend to be a little more flexible. Enjoyment of sex, the erotophobic tend to not enjoy sex as much, and the erotophilic tend to enjoy sex more. And we could say, the sexual self-concept and attractiveness. So thinking about yourself as a sexual person, and allowing yourself to feel sexually attractive in general or with a partner. They find that people who tend to fall more on the erotophilic side, more positive attitude towards sex, that they also have um, they're more comfortable. They have a more positive attitude about their own sexual self-concept of them as a sexual person, and kind of more comfortable allowing themselves to think of themselves as sexually attractive. Where they're erotophobic, a bit more hesitant. All these seem to make sense. And there's a few more we can look at too. So the development of sexual problems. So with this issue, we're not talking about necessarily disorders, like sexual disorders. We'll talk about that concept much later, but just kind of problems. So we might think of as like typical problems, sexual problems. The erotophilic, so those are more positive attitudes towards sex, tend to not develop these problems as often as those who are erotophobic. And this probably ties into this idea of sexual health care. So those who are erotophilic tend to be more conscientious about their sexual health, right? Like they're more likely to actually do things like seek treatment for it, where those who are erotophobic, they tend to not as much, right? Until it becomes a problem they can't ignore. The use of contraceptives, so practicing safe sex, right? The people who are erotophilic, more likely to practice safe sex. Those who are erotophobic, less likely. So this is an interesting statistic. You can look at this for those who are sexually active, who are not sexually active, and those that are married who are and aren't sexually active, and you still come up with this same result. So yeah, I've heard the argument that those who are erotophobic are less likely to use contraceptives because they wait until they're married. But there's also studies that have come out that shown that, those who say I want to wait until I'm married, but I'm not, I'm actually sexually active, they're less likely to use protection. So that's interesting too, right? So it's not just because they're waiting for marriage because they think this is the only person I'm going to have sex with the rest of my life. Maybe we don't need protection, which, by the way, may not be a good idea, right? And if you're married to someone else who's erotophobic, you're less likely to know if if you have an STI, for example, because you're less likely to go get checked out. Right? Okay. Now, attitudes about sexual fantasies. So those who are erotophobic, they tend to feel more guilt, if they have a sexual fantasy or if they use like pornography, they feel more guilt. They're more likely to avoid that type of stimuli that might facilitate a sexual fantasy. And those who are erotophilic are more comfortable. And then attitudes toward masturbation, you can probably guess. The erotophobic tend to have negative, not even neutral, but like negative views about masturbation. And those who are erotophilic, not neutral, but they tend to have positive views about masturbation. They say, no, it's positive. I think it's a good thing, right? They would actually, in a lot of their research too, and they have open-ended questions, they would suggest that people masturbate more often. And then the opposite is true for the erotophobic. They would say less often. And for different reasons, right? Sometimes I think they don't even know why they have these attitudes that are positive or negative. They're just saying, this is what I do. This is what was instilled in me as I grew up. And so that's why I believe it, right? But we can talk about some actual pros and cons about masturbation. Okay, so there's another scale that's very popular and is used often. This is called it's also about your sexual comfort zone, but it's the sexual inhibition or sexual excitation scale. Sometimes you get the full name, like the sexual inhibition excitation scale. Sometimes it's just called the sexual inhibition scale, which I think is like a little misleading. And sometimes it's just called the sexual excitation scale, which I think again is a little misleading because it presents like scenarios of both, like things that may inhibit or may excite. For example, here's an excitatory statement. When I'm taking a shower or bath, I easily become sexually aroused. And to what extent do you agree with this statement, right? And then an inhibitory statement would be something like, if I think I can be heard by others while having sex, I'm likely to stay sexually aroused, right? There you go. So again, it's similar to the SOS scale, but this one tends to present like scenarios or like scenes, and to have you, like the other scale, the SOS scale, indicate how much you agree or disagree with this scenario in your attitudes. But it's still a measure of attitudes. Just throw in like a little behavioral example with all of their questions. Okay. So for the inhibition excitation scales, they find very similar results from the SOS. So those who are more inhibited, they have increased the erotophobic tendencies here. A lot of that involves avoiding stimuli, or feeling like guilt and shame when they do become sexually aroused by stimuli in their environment, like seeing other people having negative attitudes and about themselves for thinking that person's really hot or having a little fantasy about them, even if it's brief, they'll feel very guilty about that. um and this is weird, but we tend to score higher on the sexual inhibition scale, even though on the last scale they have more positive attitudes towards sex. So that's interesting, right? So if we compare the results from these two scales, the general results, that okay, women have more positive attitudes than men, but they tend higher for being more inhibited. That just means they have more positive attitudes about this, but they're less likely to engage, right? That's kind of how it pans out. So not as often, maybe, not as often across a variety of settings, but more positive in general in their thoughts about sex. Where excitation, we see increased erotophilic tendencies. So that means actually like pursuing, and instead of avoiding but approaching, those things that would be like sexually arousing. It says you're maximizing reproduction, so that means having more sexual partners, or not more partners, but sex more often, with a monogamous partner. And then men tend to score higher on the sexual excitation side of these scales, right? So they may have more negative attitudes kind of about sex in general, but when presented like a behavioral scenario, they're more likely to rate it as positive. So that's a little strange. There's like a mismatch between both men and women if we compare the results from these scales, with their attitudes and their actual evaluations of behaviors, not just kind of like abstract thoughts about sex, right? So that's strange, right? To think like, okay, why would women have more positive attitudes but be more inhibited? And why would men have more negative attitudes but be more excitatory about sex? Interesting, right? Um, it's tough to interpret like why that might be. You can hear a lot of interesting kind of nature nurture arguments go on there, like socialization versus biology may be at play, but it looks like either way there's a strange discrepancy. So it's no wonder that we're confused about sex, right? This may be just an indicator that sex is complex and we're kind of confused about it, no matter if you're a man or a woman, right? It can be confusing. Or we can have um like ambivalent attitudes, like the positive and negative attitudes at the same time. All right, so let's talk about for this chapter we're going to talk about solitary sexual behaviors, right? Or I should say this first half in this video we'll talk about solitary sexual behaviors like fantasy and masturbation, right? And then the next one we'll talk about physical intimacy with somebody, sex, and things like the range of risk that comes along with that. Okay, uh, let's look at some history first here. So I don't know if you know this guy, but this is Dr. William H. Walling, and he wrote this book called Sexology in 1904. And he has some. I just take an excerpt from, like, a paraphrase him a bit from the book as he's describing the masturbator, right? So he describes the masturbator thusly: the masturbator is downcast with an averted glance in the disposition of solitude. They have a loss of memory and intelligence, a morose disposition, indifference to legitimate pleasure and sports, okay. Loss of moral faculties, right? So you become more immoral with masturbation. Listless, taken by surprise if required simply to reply to a child's questions, right? So, and then ultimately he says masturbation will be the death of you, right? So very negative views about masturbation. It sounds like Dr. William H. Walling was very much erotophobic, right? Okay, but nonetheless, interesting book still for 1904, even though he had this attitude about masturbation, which is strange. Most people masturbate, and a lot of people have very negative feelings associated with it. So he's probably just reflecting his time, but also for a lot of people, our current time as well, right? Let's look at another person here. You guys know this guy, at least you know his products, right? This is Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And, think about Kellogg's Corn Flakes, for example. Interesting story about Corn Flakes. If you want to dive into the history of that, it's humorous and it's strange, but let's just one thing at a time. So you can say about Kellogg, he was like a zealot, just like a zealous campaigner against masturbation, right? More so than Walling that we just talked about. Like Kellogg, probably because he was more mainstream, people, were aware of his products. And, he had kind of like a public image where Walling did to some degree, but mostly it was like, it was just smaller, a smaller reach, let's say. So Kellogg, he strongly warned against the habit of masturbation in his own words, claiming that there were, X amount of masturbation related deaths. Here's a quote, such a victim literally dies by his own hand, right? Among many other condemnations. Kellogg believed that the practice of what he called solitary vice caused cancer of the womb, urinary diseases, nocturnal emissions, impotence, epilepsy, insanity, mental, physical debility, dimness of vision. That's where this first comes from when people say, like, if you masturbate too much, you'll go blind or you'll get hairy palms. They're pretty much quoting Kellogg, right? If they're aware of where that came from at all. This came from books that he'd written and articles that he'd written. Let's see. He wrote in Plain Facts of Old and Young, the book he wrote, right? He issued a warning on the evils of sex. So he has 97 addresses about, the secret vice or solitary vice or what he calls self-abuse, its symptoms and results. 39 signs indicating someone is masturbating, right? So you can see them by looking at them. You can go, oh, that's a masturbator, right? He recommended to cure children from this vice by bandaging their hands, covering their genitals with patented cages that he sold, sewing their foreskin shut, electrical shock, circumcision without anesthesia. All these things he would recommend to break the habit. In order to prevent it, he advised parents first to teach children to avoid handling their genitals, and as they got more mature, to inform them of the evil consequences of masturbation. And he also warned parents against other evil associations, but he meant other people, right? Like social associations, people like servants, for example, wicked and ignorant nurses, as he called them, because he believed that they would masturbate children in order to quiet them. Um, Now there is some record of this happening, but it wasn't a regular practice. It was people who were essentially abusing children. But Kellogg would say this is what he'd go on to basically condemn nurses as well and servants for using this as a technique to pacify children. Um, Gosh, we could go on and on, but there's people like Kellogg and Graham, who created Graham's crackers. Their idea was to create, at the time they thought that foods, as they were being like imported in from other parts of the world, and at great demand, people just like fell in love with spices in the U.S. from other regions, and they believed that people who didn't like this, they believed that these spices, by ingesting them or smelling them or handling them, getting them on your skin, it would change you sexually. Like it would unlock this like repressed sexual energy, and you wouldn't be able to help yourself from performing or behaving sexually. So they created all these bland, terrible foods, right? Like Kellogg's Corn Flakes, graham crackers, not the kind with sugar on them, right? Because sugar might make you way too horny and out of control, but just bland as possible, because it wouldn't encourage sexual behaviors, right? That was like a selling point for these items. They're still around today. Of course, they don't say that today. In fact, they even have like a rooster on the box today, or some people would say that's a cock. But anyway, so we could go on and on, through history of masturbation. We could talk about Freud. We'll talk about him off and on throughout the class, the good, the bad, and the ugly of Freud. But he'd say things like, you can suffer from the effects of masturbation. He went back and forth on the idea of masturbation, but generally had a negative attitude toward it. Here's St. Thomas Aquinas, and it says here, non-procreative forms of sex are worse. They are sins directly against God himself, as the creator of nature. So taking out of context, you're like, well, what does that mean? They're worse. Like, what's he talking about? So according to St. Thomas Aquinas and many religious figures at the time, and still this is carried on today, I think, even if they don't know like the impetus of where these ideas came from of masturbation being bad. St. Thomas wrote about the four non-procreative forms of sex being worse, and masturbation is one of them. But worse, he meant um, he even go on to write that it's worse than rape, right? Masturbation is worse than rape because, after all, even in a rape, there is a probability that there could be procreation, that there could be life created from that. With masturbation, there's like zero probability of creating a child. Therefore, it's worse than rape, right? Pretty controversial thing to say. I don't think that's what most people mean now when they say that for religious reasons they're against um, something like masturbation. I don't think they would say that it's worse than rape, but I don't know. You have to ask them point blank, I suppose. But that's kind of an ugly thought, but a common thought, right, for his time in particular. All right, now let's look at, man, we could go back to things like medieval times where female orgasms were thought to be necessary for conception, therefore required. Um, so they thought if you didn't have an orgasm, then there'd be no procreation. So that's kind of interesting. Man, we could go to the 19th century where, now we're talking about sexual tension being diagnosed as hysteria, right? So you have an actual image here of this woman actually like being brought to orgasm through different means. This one, I forget what they called this, something like a hydro pump or something like that, but they're basically blasting like warm water onto this woman's genitals and bringing her to masturbation to cure her of her sexual tension. It's like, well, what do you know? Yeah, I felt pretty relaxed after something like that. But there you go. But it's a weird time because it was also considered like a sin still to masturbate, or in some cases, like in Freud's time, even sinful if you enjoyed sex, even if it was in the act, if it was in the attempt of procreation. So you're trying to have a child. If it felt good and you liked it, still sinful, right? But you could go to a doctor where they had all kinds of different tools, to help you reach climax. Then it was considered okay, but you still couldn't say that you liked it, right? If you were considered, like a pious person during those times. All right, mid 20th century, of course, we start to see some changes here. This is Kinsey, and I think his wife is in there, a lot of his graduate students, right? So mid 20th century, 1940s, in this case, we could say 40% of women had their first orgasms through masturbation. So that's a huge change, right? We get to the 1940s and we get Kinsey's reports, and 40% of women saying, yes, I do masturbate, and it is how I had my first orgasm, right? So huge change and shifts in culture just from survey research, and the results of that book changing people's perceptions on thoughts about sex. Okay, 1960s, kind of moving on. We're talking about more about orgasms here. The 60s, and really still today, you still see a lot of this, looking at like the evolutionary significance of the orgasm. Like, why do we have them at all, right? So, it's commonly thought that, well, when you have sex, nearly every time a man orgasms, it's necessary for procreation. And maybe it's just a byproduct of actual ejaculation. But what about women? If it's not necessary for procreation, does it even help in procreation? Like, what is it? Is it something it feels so good that it encourages us to have more sex? So it's kind of like, what is the function of an orgasm, and particularly the female orgasm? Right, that becomes the focus and for a lot of sex researchers in the 60s, and it continues today, right? People have these types of debates. And then now we get into the 2000s, right? So this is I don't know if you know this is Jocelyn Elders, and her focus, and really starting in like the late 90s, early 2000s, the focus became what are the health benefits of orgasms? Like, they're actually good for you in some way. And this is Jocelyn Elders. She was, by the way, Surgeon General of the United States. I may not be correct about this, but I want to say she was maybe the first black and also first woman. I have to look that up. I think that's true though. Both those things true for her, for the Surgeon General of the U.S. So big ups to Jocelyn Elders. Um, but during this time, scientists are finding things out like orgasms and having more and then more often are correlated with health. So there's a negative correlation with cancer. There's a negative correlation with erectile dysfunction. So that meant the more you masturbate, decreases chance of cancer, decreases erectile dysfunction, and then increasing masturbation is correlated with an increase in like overall immune system health, mood, as you might imagine, stamina during sex, among other things, right? We'll talk about as we go through this chapter and subsequent chapters. So, we've come a long way from medieval times to now when on our ideas about orgasm, masturbation, we've come a long way too, but I still feel majority of people still feel shame about masturbating. Doesn't mean they don't do it, but they do have some kind of adverse reaction, especially right afterward. All right, so let's talk about fantasy a bit. And this is normally where I would ask a class to give me a list of the good and bad when it comes to sexual fantasy, right? Like, what are the pros and what are the cons? So let's do let's do a list, pros and cons of fantasies. But first, just kind of point out just kind of how amazing our brains are as a powerful sex organ, right? I mean, that's what fantasy is. You're imagining these things happening to you, and sometimes they're spontaneous. So we talk about spontaneous fantasies, which require like no effort. They just seem to come, which seem like out of nowhere. Um, I can only relate to like my experiences, but I bet there's a lot of you who, when you were younger, it's like these sexual fantasies would just like pop out into your head out of nowhere. You just had no clue. Even at times where you didn't want them to be there, they would sit in the middle of class. You're bored and you're just looking at the ceiling, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, okay, now I'm thinking about sex. I didn't intend to. It just happened, right? So there's those take no effort, spontaneous fantasies, and then there's those fantasies which do take conscious effort, and you can like explicitly draw on them. I had a student once tell me that when he was a teenager, he had like, you know, his imagination. He reported it was like files on his computer, but in his head, and that he could like if he was going to masturbate in particular, like he said he'd be laying in his bed, he was going to masturbate, and it was just like he could just like flip through all the fantasies, almost like a deck of cards or a Rolodex, like he used to keep phone numbers in, and he would just like pick one out, right? And then he had all these different types of fantasies within this Rolodex, and he could explicitly like look for one that he wanted. It sounds a lot like how pornography websites work today, but it was all just in his head, right? I thought, man, this guy is really good at fantasizing, right? So those were conscious though, and you could draw on them and like create ones and save them. It's like really explicit, right? And we could say that fantasy is often part of masturbation, and of course often also part of sexual intimacy with a partner, and that can bring along with it all kinds of potential for increased pleasure, but also increased insecurities. But it should lead to communication, right? Okay, but now to the pros and cons. So it's kind of like I guess I should say, what are the functions of fantasy? Does it have a function? And we could say on the positive side, it's a safe sexual outlet, right? I mean, there's no one to harm there unless you're doing it so much that you're harming yourself, harming your skin. um, but safe comparatively to all other types of sex. It can enhance arousal. So if you have issues with arousal, fantasy can be helpful. It's also used as types of treatments for sexual problems. So there's like a therapeutic use or function for fantasy, which we will go over in this class later. It can relieve things like sexual anxiety and guilt and doubt, right? And I guess you could also say could really relieve boredom, right? So all those things could be positive. when you're doing it yourself, right? It's a whole different issue, I think, when you're doing it with someone else. Then you open it up for potential for even like I said earlier, like more satisfying sex. But there's also the potential for becoming self-conscious if you don't know how to communicate with your partner, right? So it could be both positive and negative involving other people, right? But so okay, other things about issues with fantasy that might fall into the negative category could be guilt, worry, and shame. So it can go the opposite way for people, right? I mean, that's the problem with being a self-conscious human, is that you can be conscious of yourself, and it can be good or it can be bad, right? It could be the fantasies can be intrusive, can be disruptive, maybe even disturbing, right? Your fantasy could be disturbing for you. For a small percentage of people, and very small, sexual fantasies can interfere with what are called ADLs, or activities of daily living, right? It can be so intrusive. There's a risk of embarrassment with sexual fantasy, right? Or relationship stress if sharing your fantasy with a partner, like that could happen. They may not like your fantasy, or they may not like the idea of fantasy at all, right? And that's problematic, right? If you're with a partner and they're like, I demand that you have no more sexual fantasies, I should be enough. It's like, okay, you know, that's something you definitely would need to talk about, in great detail, I would think. Um, what people may have performance issues when there's the absence of that fantasy, right? So that can be an issue. Many people have fantasies of like forbidden or even maybe illegal sexual acts, and that can lead to all different types of negative emotions for yourself. But we should point out, right? Fantasy is not a predictor of your behavior, right? And in fact, there's a lot of women that have fantasies that are very aggressive, very even violent sometimes, but it doesn't mean they want that to happen in their actual life just because they're having this fantasy. So I'd say, just be cautious, when you're trying to interpret your own fantasies. Don't be too hard on yourself. If sometimes they get dark and you go, you could say, okay, that's good for fantasy space, but it's not so good for my real life, right? I don't actually want that, right? Or but maybe you do, and there's a safe way to make it happen as long as it's not illegal and it's consensual, right? Because the evidence indicates that, for example, um, people who are sex offenders, they actually do have these fantasies about illegal sexual acts more often than non-offenders, but they do tend to feel bad about them, not as bad as people who are not sex offenders, um, but that a larger percent than you would imagine have these types of sexual fantasies, but are never going to act on them, don't have any problem with like impulse control. They're not going to act them out. So I think that's important to point out too, like this idea of fantasy and reality, that there's fantasies people have, but they just definitely do not want to experience them in real life. um Sometimes it's because it's taboo, it's not sexually like acceptable. It could be violent, right? They don't want that in their life. But then on the other hand, you can take these fantasies and they almost become fun in a way to talk about. Like my wife and our friends, sometimes we don't do this a lot, but often we've played that game, like we call it "Who's in Your Hot Tub," and it's all, it has to be like famous people. And the joke is that like these famous people will probably have nothing to do with us in real life, right? And we're all like these committed relationships, and we know it's just a silly game, right? It's kind of like saying, who do you think is super hot, right? Or sometimes couples will say things like, okay, you get a free pass for that person. If that person ever said, they wanted to have sex with you, that's your free pass. But the joke usually is that we're aware it's never going to happen, right? Like, yeah, I think about my wife and I, we've played that silly game where, like, for her, maybe, I don't speak for her, but I know in the past it's been like Jason Momoa, for example, right? Or like Idris Alba. Like, if so, I'm like, sure, if those men ever want to have sex with you, and we happen to run into them like at Vaughn's or whatever, you know, then that's your free pass. But honestly, of course, I wouldn't want that to happen. I would not be okay with that, right? And just like she wouldn't be okay with my free pass. It's like Salma Hayek. It's not ever going to happen anyway. And I wouldn't want to do that I would, but I wouldn't. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So it can be fun and kind of funny too. And those tend to be like the non-threatening kind of sexual fantasies. Kind of frame them that way. Okay, so they can have it can be positive, negative. You can definitely have, um, a difference between what is fantasy and what is reality. So, okay, I want to tell you now about a study I read recently that I thought you'd find interesting. So forgive me, I'm going to look at my notes to tell you about this one. But this was done by Anderson in 2012. So it's about 8 9 years old. But he was looking at taboo topics in romantic relationships and sexual communication in romantic relationships. He called this an investigation into the disclosure of sexual fantasies, right? And so first of all, what he had couples do, there's like multiple parts to the study. The first thing was they had couples rate kind of what the most taboo topics in their relationship. And they had things like money, religion, politics, discussions of exclusivity, like how exclusive are we with each other? So they weren't all just married couples, but even with married couples, it's like, how exclusive are we? So that can be complicated, especially if one person thinks like, we're totally monogamous. The other person is like, we're monogamish, right? Um, Prior relationships are a big taboo thing that's difficult for couples to talk about. But the most uh, difficult and taboo topic that these couples reported was sex. That was the thing that was the most taboo. So then the next step of the study was, all right, within the category just of sex, which sexual topics were the most difficult for couples to talk about? And it was fantasy, right? That's really interesting. So, okay, the study had 500 couples in it. It's like 1,000 people, right? And they're asked questions like, did they receive a benefit from sharing their sexual fantasies with their partners? Another question, did they act out their sexual fantasies? Third question, is there a benefit to sharing these sexual fantasies with your partner? What were the sexual satisfaction levels and what were the relationship satisfaction levels? Right. So the findings, with these questions were this, right? The first one, if the couple talked about their sexual fantasies, they were more likely to act them out, right? So there was that. They did find that it was improving for their rates of sexual satisfaction and overall for improving their relationship satisfaction levels. So ultimately, it was good for these couples to talk about it. They were more likely to act them out and they felt more sexually satisfied. And overall, they felt more satisfied with their relationship. So they reported having like a deeper, more emotional connection with their partner. They felt more vulnerable, but they also felt more trust with them. And that's really like a definition of intimacy for most people, that vulnerability and trust. They also said that if you can discuss something at the very top of the taboo list, like sex and then sexual fantasy being kind of the top of the top, then really, it can open you up to talking about other taboo topics, right? Like politics, religion, money, right? Prior relationships. And then also, let's see, if you disclose the sexual fantasy, if these couples disclose them to each other but didn't act them out, there was still a significant improvement in their sexual satisfaction and in their relationship satisfaction. It wasn't The number wasn't as high as if they actually acted them out, but it was still an improvement. So talking about your fantasies with your partners, if you guys are practicing that type of communication, can be beneficial for your relationship, across the board, but also sexually. Okay, now here's another interesting part to the study. Well, they found that for those that did share their sexual fantasies, that, I like in the article, they said, not all fantasies are created equal. So whether the fantasy was simple or elaborate, it didn't matter for the increase in sexual and relational satisfaction. It didn't matter if it was really simple fantasy, we might think of as like a, not a very taboo one or like risque, or if it was, they both, it didn't matter. They both had benefits. They both seemed to work to increase satisfaction levels. So These researchers had other people read the fantasies that were written down, right? So they had these couples type out their fantasies, and then they had raters, read them and rate them for, zero being like no fantasy, all the way to three being the most specific, detailed fantasy, right? And then they wanted to see if there was a difference in satisfaction levels based on that specificity of the fantasy, like how complex it was. Was there like a increase in satisfaction going from a 0, 1, 2, and 3? Did they see like a linear increase? So you might be wondering, like, what's an example of a level 3 fantasy, right? So here you go. I got an excerpt from the researchers right here. So here's an example of like the most complex fantasy they found within their research. So this is in quotes, right? Is what someone wrote. They said, my sexual fantasy includes being taken into the bedroom, having previously dressed for an intimate evening under my professional clothes of the day, and being slowly undressed, tied seductively to the bed, and pleasured by my romantic partner's mouth all over my body. Silk ties at the arms and feet, blindfolded, but with a warmth and scent of candles lighted around the room. So it's pretty detailed, right? I mean, it's not necessarily like a really, really wild fantasy, but there's a lot of detail in there, even about, like the setting, the environment. So it might sound like conventional for a fantasy, but it's the details that matter, the why, the who, the how, the where, right? So that'd be a level 3. That'd be considered complex. Here's another example. I figure I'd throw in that is like not conventional, but it is a level 3, just for fun, right? Okay, so here's another quote, right? Another fantasy. It starts with a candlelit dinner. He's Rupert Grint. I had to look that up. I knew that name. That's the dude. That's Ron Weasley from Harry Potter, right? So he's like Rupert Grint or Gint, except he has a mullet. He comes across the table toward me, throwing our dinner to the floor. He takes me by the hand and leads me to another room where there's a hot tub full of vanilla pudding. He throws me into the pudding head first. Unfortunately, I can't swim in pudding, but he jumps in and he rescues me. And I've never been so turned on or so covered in pudding in all my life. Little did I know, while struggling to rescue me from the pudding, all of our clothes happened to slide off, and Aidan Turner, another actor, suddenly appears as our naked lifeguard and begins giving me the hottest, wettest mouth to mouth resuscitation, not necessarily on my lips where I breathe. I'm not overly exhilarated until they came at me and start tag teaming me. It was getting hot and heavy. And after we reach our steaming climax, we clothe, we shake hands, and we go our separate ways. So, yeah, maybe that's not as conventional as the first one, but of course, it's got all the details, the why, the who, the how, the where, right? So, level 3, a level 1 fantasy, which is like an indicator of a fantasy, but not complex, or they're much shorter as you can imagine. Something like this: we have sex in the shower. Level 1, right? Another level 1 would be we have sex in the grassy meadow. He's in leather and I'm a slutty nurse. It's like, okay, right? There you go. So that was considered level 1. Now, here are the findings. So, those with the most specific fantasies and non disclosure with their partner had the lowest sexual and relational satisfaction levels. So, the people that had the most complex fantasies but didn't share them, they had the lowest levels of sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction compared to all the other groups. That's interesting to know, right? So that means there could be some power in the fantasies and sharing them with others, no matter how complex they are. But, asterisk, if you're a person with very, very complex fantasies, but you feel like you can't share them with your partner, that could be a problem, right? Or your life could just be so much better, if you felt comfortable doing those things. Okay, so I found that to be really interesting. Now, here are some common themes in the fantasies, if you're wondering, right? For 40% of the women, the themes of their fantasies involved like dominance and submission. So with them typically, being dominated, being tied up and handcuffed. There were rape fantasies in there, being physically dominated, where his body is used like as a constraint. Um, Now, remember, that doesn't mean that they want they don't, these women didn't want to have non consensual sex with someone, right? They didn't actually want to be involved in the act of rape, right? but it was part of their fantasy being dominated. It was like an extreme example of that. For men, they didn't find an overly dominant theme for men, or a theme that was that the majority of men shared, except for sex with multiple partners, right? And still, that was only like 15% of these 500 men said that was high on their list, fantasy. So men were kind of all over the place, but women had this theme going on. Now here's the other one that was interesting. So okay, for those that had like a partner in their fantasy, they want to know, okay, who was it? Who do you fantasize about? And typically for men and for women, it wasn't an actual person, right? Like it wasn't a specific person. Instead, it was more like a caricature, right? How dreams and fantasies can be, right? It was more like like a character, like a firefighter, or a nurse, or cheerleader, that kind of thing, right? Police officer, that type of thing. It was more like a person in a role, instead of a specific person. Only of all these like 1,000 people in the study, only 5% listed a specific person as an object of their fantasy, right? So that they could like name the person, and that includes like people from their real life or like celebrity type figures. So this study is from 2012, and the person, if you're curious, that showed up most often as like this specific person as the object of their fantasy, this one I couldn't believe it, was Flo from the Progressive Insurance ads. So this is 2012 Flo, I think, is when she was like first in commercials, right? But still, it's like, oh, really? Okay. So now I went on YouTube, of course, and had to watch some of those old commercials, and I was like, all right, I could see it. I could see how people be into that. She's funny. She's pretty, sure, whatever. Okay, but anyway, that doesn't matter. The take home message is that sharing your fantasies with your partner or acting them out, it won't save your relationship. That's for sure. However, it can increase intimacy, and that intimacy can, increase satisfaction levels. Okay, so let's look at what your book has here, because I've read a lot of articles and chapters of human sexuality books that talk about like kind of like ranking fantasies and who's having what kind of fantasy. Here's what your book says, but there's always some variation in these studies, except for the women who tend to have, like in the article I read, like the fantasy about being submissive. And of course, it's not all women, right? So, but that's just what showed up in literature as the most common, and still not even the majority. It's usually like 40% of women. It's just the most common theme. So here you go, if you're curious. So fantasies here with no significant sex differences. So for men and women did not differ in these, right? So like touching, kissing sensuously, naked caressing, sex in unusual locations, usually romantic locations, intercourse in unusual or positions, things they haven't tried, masturbating with their partners, performing sexual acts in front of a mirror so they can see themselves, having the partner watch you, being tied up. So like all these were really no difference in the rating between like men and women. Like did men or women fantasize about one of these themes more than the other? No, right? They're about the same. These are in rank order, so you can also see what was most common and least common. So these things show up in fantasies for men and women about the same rate. Here's some that are different, right? So watching your partner undress, that was different. The first column here is men, the second is women. Um, Oral sex, slightly, was higher for men than women. Sex with a virgin, much higher for men than women. Um, that one is always strange to me. I guess I obviously don't share that fantasy at all. But that's an interesting one. The two or more lovers at the same time, more men than women. Sex with a mysterious stranger, more men than women. Getting married, more women than men. Being rescued by a future lover, more women than men. Homosexual fantasies, if the people are heterosexual, more common for women than for men. So you can see this one's from 1994. Um, it looks like maybe fantasies have changed or shifted, or maybe it's just the way they're being asked in these surveys. But there's some variation there. So take all these with like a grain of salt, right? But let's look at the top fantasies. Let's do that. All right, top fantasies. So for women, number 10 at the bottom of their list was sex with more than three people, men and women. And then for men, it was sex with more than three women. By the way, these are all heterosexual people. I believe in this survey. Let me check. Move myself here. This is the 2015 one. I believe that's true for this one. That these are all heterosexual people. Or participants in the study. Okay, number 9 for women was sex in a public place. Number 9 for men was masturbating my partner. 8 was being dominated sexually, and for men, number 8 was performing oral sex on a woman. That one is the one that is different. The one that by this 2015 study, usually this one for women is a bit higher, but it's always on the top 10 list. Okay, number 7 for women was sex with someone I know that is not my partner. Ooh, right? That means like from your actual life. That doesn't really show up in too many of the fantasy like survey research I've seen, but when it does show up more often for women than men usually. And for men, number 7 was sex and romantic location. 6 was masturbating my partner for women. Hey, that works out. That's number 9 for men, right? So we're starting to see some uh, similarities across these lists. Ejaculating on my partner for men, that was number 6. Number 5 for women was being masturbated by my partner. Hey, look, that's number 9. That's number 9 for yeah. For men. So they're like, hey, that's part of my fantasy too. Let's work this out. Watching two women was number 5 for men. Number 4 for women was performing oral sex on a man, and number 4 for men was sex in an unusual place. So that's kind of similar to number 9 for women, public place, unusual place, right? So you can see there's some places where like there's probably some shared fantasies here that if you wanted to act them out or not, that you may be able to work out. Taking part in oral sex. This is where the survey research gets weird because if you look at the questions on the survey, this one, number 3, taking part in oral sex, what does that mean? That means like receiving it. They kind of lumped all of them together. So either giving oral sex, receiving oral sex, or simultaneous oral sex, right? It all kind of fell into this category. So I don't know. I would probably take that one off the list as far as ranking goes. But like something, oral sex is involved somehow. It's number 3. That's in there for men too. I think it's number 2. So sex with someone I know is not my partner. That's also for high on the list. Number 3 for men. And that was number 7 for women. Sex in unusual locations, number 2 for women. And sex with 2 women is number 2 for men. And that's pretty typical. You see that high on the list. And then sex in romantic location was number 1 for women in this survey. And taking part in oral sex, another big, weird, nebulous one, was number 1 for men. So I would take that one. It's number 3 for women, right? Like right here. And number 1 for men. I would just take that out of the research. It's too much contamination in what they're trying to measure. So that would make to take that away. The number 1 was romantic location, then unusual location. What do these mean, right? And then you have public place. So it's hard to make sense of these. But interesting. I like to point out that there's some similarities across the lists, and that couples could have something to talk about if they wanted to, and it could help to increase intimacy, which could help increase their satisfaction levels in their relationship. Okay, now also say this. I have some, oh shoot, I need to update this, but here's some older data from 2016 from the website Pornhub. Because pornography is so closely tied to like masturbation, that it's like you can have someone like act out the fantasies right there for you. It's like you're living vicariously through porn, and there's good and bad things about that. I have conflicting thoughts about pornography. Most of it has to do with, are the people who are involved in making it, is this all consensual? It's not coerced. They don't feel pressured. Like they all want to be there doing this. And then, if it's so problematic that it leads to, you know, creating like a Pavlovian type of connection between pornography use and masturbation to the point where it has like health detriments, then of course I think that's bad taken to its extreme. Um, but that's my judgment on it, and then if everybody wants to be involved, it's all consensual and it's not causing any kind of health detriment, then I think it's okay. But the thing about sites like Pornhub is that they keep amazing records of what people are looking at, and um, well, all different types of demographic data. So I thought I would just show you, and this has only increased since then. Some of the themes have changed that you'll see in the lists I'm going to present to you here. So you don't have to take notes on this. I'm not going to ask you about this stuff about Pornhub. I just thought you would find it interesting. So in 2016, let me look at this: 91 billion, uh, yeah, almost 92 billion videos viewed on this one website alone, right? That's 12 and a half video views for every person on the planet. That's, you know, over 4.5 billion hours watched, 191,625,000 days. You can break it down to weeks, into 424,641 years of content, all from 2016. Now let's look at some other stats you find interesting. Oh, no, 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 never mind. I forgot the whole sexual marketplace chapter. We'll go into great detail about pornography. But gosh, for now, we could point out a couple things. Thought I had, maybe it's on the next section. Let me check something. I'll come back. But for now, I'll say this about the health effects on pornography. There have been a couple studies that suggest that, and I say they suggest just because we need to do more data on this, I think, is that for people that have for men that have erectile dysfunction, and they give them medication, right? I think like Viagra, for example, that might help them. What they find is that for those men who were kind of going through prepubescence and then puberty long before high-speed internet, that the medications worked better for them, right? Meaning that they actually could achieve arousal, with the aid of medication. And all the medication does essentially is, it has to do with blood flow, right? So that was enough for them to achieve arousal. Now, these tend to be the older men in the studies, right? So if you think about it that way, we can say here's the older men and the younger men who have erectile dysfunction. For the older men, the medication worked great, right? There are almost none that didn't have, an arousal effect they were looking for. Some of them had side effects they weren't looking for, but still the arousal was there. For the younger men, for most of them, it worked as well. But for some of them, and a large portion, right? Something like 25%, I believe, is like a quarter of them, the medication didn't work, right? And they're like, well, why would that be? And so then if we look at people's neurology, you find differences there between their expectation and response types of chemicals like dopamine in particular. And it wasn't an issue of blood flow, it was an issue of like psychological arousal. That wasn't there. And the same areas where you think about creating novelty and variety and what that does to things like your dopamine levels and other stress types of hormones that create a physiological response very quickly in you through your autonomic nervous system, right? That there were some differences between these old and young men, and the age really depended on, if you separated them by, okay, here's where most people had high speed internet, before and after this marker, you could split them that way between old and young. And those younger guys, the medication didn't work so well. And I think it might have something to do with how much porn they're looking at as they masturbate. Now, that's kind of speculation at this point, if without more studies, but it's something to think about, right? Something to think about. and kind of the effects of pornography after high-speed internet that maybe we're just starting to see now. All right, so we will pick up with a second lecture video on this chapter, and we will talk about shared experiences, a little more actually about like self pleasure too, but more about we think of as coitus. When most people think about sexual pleasure and sex, they think about heteronormative sex, they think about, vaginal penetration. And of course, that is not the only aspect of sex, the only type of sex. Um, but we will talk about that too, right? We'll talk about that in the next video. So if images like this one or things that are even images that are even more graphic um, are an issue for you, just another warning. There's explicit content on these slides. So just make sure that your environment is appropriate. Okay. Well, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.